Hello, everyone, and welcome to Developer Days ANZ 2021. Thank you for joining us today. As you all know, that this is an exclusive event specially curated for you, and you can post your questions in the Q&A panel on the top right. You can see a separate section for posting the questions. If you have any questions, please do post your questions in the Q&A panel there. And you can also interact with our product managers and experts today towards the end of the session. You can click the ask to share video and audio button at the top and we'll unmute you so that you may ask your question directly to the speakers. Today, I'm privileged to welcome our first speakers of the event, Shyam Subramaniam and Varad Varadarajan. Shyam and Varad are directors of product management. And with that, I don't want to take too much of time. I now want to welcome Shyam and Varad to tell us how to get started with the Salesforce functions.
All right. Thanks, Satya. Happy to be here. It's great to see so much interest in a new product such as Salesforce Functions. As Satya mentioned, my name is Shyam Subramanian. I'm one of the product managers on the Salesforce Elastic Services team. And with me, I have my colleague, Varad Varadarajan. Varad, would you like to introduce yourself to the audience, please?
Yeah, thank you, Shyam. Hello, everyone. Yeah, I'm very excited to be part of this presentation and talk to you about functions. I am also a director in the functions team. I mainly focus on functions and microservices. And, as I said, it's a pleasure to speak to you today. Thanks.
Thanks, Varad. So with that, let's get the session kicked off. Before we get started, here's our safe harbor statement. You should be familiar with this. We encourage you to make purchasing decisions based on what's generally available today. And with that said, what I would like to do is to set a quick agenda here to set expectations for what's coming up in this presentation. I will give a quick overview of functions for about 15 minutes. Then I will turn over the floor to Varad so he can do a deep dive on functions as specifically related to the architecture and to the core. At the end, we'll have about 10 minutes of Q&A. And there are also demos in the presentation. I don't think we have time to get into the demos, but we will make sure that these demos get distributed to you, the audience, after the event. All right, so let's get started with a quick introduction. So what are Salesforce functions? Salesforce functions is at the confluence of three things. Elastic compute that is closely integrated with the Salesforce platform, developer tools that you're already familiar with, and modern languages that you want to bring into the Salesforce ecosystem. So functions actually plays a very important part at the confluence of these three things. So here's a very high-level overview of how functions work. Later on in the presentation, we'll get into a more detailed architecture diagram. But for now, to just set the context, this is a very simple overview. So your Salesforce CLI and VS Code extensions supports function development side by side with Salesforce development. Functions require source-driven development. Functions, when they are deployed, gets into its own space, but that space is secured by built-in connection to orgs. So what does this let you do? Now you can really focus on building functions and invoking them seamlessly from Apex within core. We will be supporting more invocation types in the future, but at this point, we support Apex invocation of functions. So how does functions development work? So functions makes pro-code development as easy as 1, 2, 3. Step one, we provide with all the scaffolding you need for writing functions, complete with context of your org. Step 2, once you develop your functions, you deploy your functions in its own private space. Step 3, we provide Apex constructs to invoke your functions, both async and sync. So while functions are available for you to develop easily and quickly, let's talk about when you want to use functions. When you need elastic scale while still staying on the platform. And as a bonus, you get to expand your talent pool and leverage open source libraries in Java, JavaScript, and soon Python. So when you see this pattern, it's a great time to use functions. Now, there are times when functions is not that appropriate, especially if your logic is deeply embedded in a transaction or a trigger. You should probably stay within Apex and develop your code there. But if your logic can be partitioned and processed async, functions could be a great solution. All right, so that's a very quick overview of what function does and how you can start using it. Now let's talk about use cases for functions. There are some really common use cases for functions. First, data in image processing. Anything that you can do async that doesn't have to be real time, you can use functions to process data and images. You can do event-based processing and automation. And you can also use functions to integrate between Salesforce and third-party APIs. So there are some commonly used function use cases on that slide. When you get a chance, please do look through them. So talking about Salesforce functions, what we learned from working with a lot of the pre-release customers and partners. We had participants from different industries with users ranging from developers, architects, and directors. One of the things we noticed was that, for example, with Airbnb, they were delighted to know that they can start using functions with their no developers can code directly on the platform. There are a few things that stand out based on feedback from customers, but I'll mention a couple of things that have come up again and again. The first one is the word easy. It came up quite a bit with how functions development is closely integrated with platform development. It's a simple add to what you already know and do with Salesforce development. The second thing that came up is the flexibility of going from Apex to other languages when solving problems. So from that perspective, you should consider functions as one more tool in your toolkit that you can go into and say, hey, here's a way I can solve this problem that I have with functions. All right, so with that, a bit about what's coming up. We have a very full roadmap for how functions will evolve over the next few releases, starting with native data support and a functions manager UI so you can monitor metrics related to your functions. Additional languages, versioning for functions, and new ways to invoke functions are all part of the roadmap as well. Again, remember the safe harbor statement. These are all roadmap items to bring in future releases. You should really make purchasing decisions based on what functions has today in its GA. All right, so with that, I'm going to turn the floor over to Varad. Varad, if you can walk us through the deep dive, that'll be awesome. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Shyam. So I'm going to go through a deep dive of functions in the next few slides. So next slide, please. So what you see here is a pictorial view of how Salesforce Functions interacts with core. As you can see here, it's a very smooth interaction. Functions are basically acting like an extension of the core platform. On the left side, you see the Salesforce box there, and it invokes a function through a standard programmatic or declarative means through Apex or through a flow, and that is indicated by the number one, which actually flows from Salesforce into the function space. And on the right side, you have the function executing in the function space, and the function itself can be written in Node.js or JavaScript or JavaScript or Java or TypeScript. And the function can interact with core using the SDK that we provide. And the invocation of this function can be either synchronous or asynchronous. And finally, the function itself can call other third-party connectors and APIs. So at the end of all this, the function would come back. It would return a result back, which is indicated by the number 3 back into core. Now, if you contrast what we will do today without functions, you will see that there is a very big difference and a huge improvement for us. In the old days, before functions, what we would have to do is we have to do all the wiring and plumbing. We have to set up a connected app, and we have to actually do all of the things to handle the security to make this call from one Salesforce org to the external or space to be secure. But with functions, we execute completely within the trust boundary, and we don't have to worry about setting up all this plumbing and wiring, and we focus exclusively on the business logic. So that's the power of the functions platform. Next slide. So here we have the anatomy of a function. Specifically, we are talking about JavaScript and how a function would appear, the syntax would appear when you create a function in JavaScript. As you can see, there are 3 important parameters that you pass to the function. One is the event itself, which is the actual payload which you would send when you invoke this function from Apex in Salesforce. And the second one is the context, and this is actually the context of the org and the SDK, and this is automatically set. And the third one is the logger, which is again automatically set in JavaScript. This gives you the ability to log the results of the function. I will explain more about this in a future slide. Next slide. So here we're talking about the same thing with how this would look if you are a Java programmer and you want to create a Java function. It's essentially the same in many respects. You still have to pass in the event, and you still see the context as well. But the key difference here is the logger is actually from log4j. So you would create an instance of logger, and you would be able to log through that one. So that is the only difference here. Next slide. All right, so this slide shows how you would invoke this function from Apex. So now you are in Salesforce side, you're writing an Apex class and a method, and inside that method, you're going to invoke a function. So as you can see here, I am creating the method, which is called invoke. And inside that, I am actually first setting up the function. And then I'm calling the function invoke method and passing the payload to it. So this is an example of a synchronous invocation. So I make the invoke and I get the response back in the string, and I would return that response to the caller of the Apex method. Next slide. So here we show some interesting patterns that are available today for you to use with functions. The first one, as we discussed, is our synchronous invocation. So pattern 1, you see Apex making a synchronous call request to a function, and it returns a response back within the same thread. And the arrow that you see as a SDK is the ability of the function to be interact with core using SOCL through the context and through the unit of work API. And pattern 2 is a very similar one, but it is an asynchronous call. So here Apex makes a call, and it returns, the function returns immediately with a response, but it continues to execute. And once the function completes execution, it would call back to the calling function that has been specified when the function was invoked, and the callback would return the results for the function. Pattern 3 is a low-code version of the same, where you have a flow invoking a function, but a flow would have to go through Apex, and the Apex would call the function. So the Apex would be an invocable Apex, and the flow would invoke this Apex through the standard process of creating a flow and invoking a Apex, and this would in turn call the function. And pattern 4 is the example of a Lightning Web Component being able to call a function. Again, it goes through Apex. So to those who are familiar with the LWCs, you have the ActWire protocol, where you can actually wire an Apex method to an LWC, and the Apex method would in turn call the function. So I'll show you some examples of this in the next few slides. Next slide. So here is an example of the flow that I described, which is pattern 3 in the previous slide. So this is a simple flow, and on the extreme right, you see an invocable action, which is created, and that is basically wired to an Apex method, which actually calls a function. So the flow itself is like a normal flow. You just call the Apex through an invocable action, and the Apex in turn would call the function. Next slide. And here is an example of a Lightning Web Component, which is calling a function. So on the right side panel, you see Apex wire method to function. That's actually a Lightning Web Component. And this LWC is actually wired to an Apex, which is in turn calling the function. And the function in this example is just basically getting a list of accounts. So what it's actually doing is this function is making a call back into core through the SDK, getting the list of accounts and displaying it. So this is a contrived example, but you can see the power of what we are doing here. So we are calling from LWC, we are calling Apex, which calls a function, which goes and calls back core and returns the results, and the results are displayed in the LWC component. Next slide. So there are a number of limits that you should be aware of when you are developing functions. For one thing, we have much higher limits than what we are used to with Apex. So a function can execute for 15 minutes, and it can also have up to 3 gigabytes of memory. And if you contrast that with Apex, you have Apex timeouts, which are much smaller, and also the memory that an Apex can handle is the heap size is also much smaller. Functions can basically expand in both the time and the memory space. In addition to that, you also have 235 API calls, 235,000 API calls per day through the SDK once you purchase a function license. And these are all the calls that are made from the SDK through the unit of work or the query patterns that I described earlier. And another limit that you should be aware of is the payload limit. And this is basically the Apex limit, which is 6 MB for synchronous and 12 MB for asynchronous. So Shyam, I'm not seeing the screen. Are you sharing it? Oh, okay, you are. Okay. So this limit, which is the 6 MB for synchronous and 12 MB for asynchronous, is the same limit that you are familiar with Apex. But you have to keep this in mind when you are passing the payload string, because that would in turn occupy your heap space in Apex. Next slide. So this slide is an example of how you would use logging within your function. This is showing a JavaScript code. You are making a request through the context, the data API to select ID and name from account, and you're logging the results through the logger. And as I said before, the logger is built in JavaScript. It's passed as one of the parameters. It's actually included as one of the parameters. And if you want to do the same thing in Java, you would have to use the SL4J extension and library, and basically instantiate a logger object. And the logs that the logging that you do here will be visible for you from the console or from the log drain. So you can set up a log drain and be able to see the logs from there, or you can just see it on the console while you are developing through the IDE. Next slide. A few points on compliance. So right now, the functions that are available in GA are basically executing in the US East region in Amazon. And they are already certified for SOC Type 2 compliance. And on the roadmap are other compliance certifications like HIPAA, PCI, and ISO. And another point we have to keep in mind is the functions currently do not have any data storage. So there is no data that is stored permanently within functions. And this would be something that you can keep in mind if you need to think about data residency requirements in your region. So I think with that, I am done with my presentation, Shyam. I think we may have more time for the demos.
Right. So, thanks, Varad. So at this point, we are at section 3, demos. The one slide I want to put out here is kind of how to get started with functions. And there are really, 3 steps to this. The first one is, you can really get started with local development. I know there was a Q&A earlier in the session about, when functions trial would be available. It is coming later this month. I don't have an exact date. But meanwhile, you can actually get started with local development. In fact, you'd be able to even access data from your org and execute the function locally. So what you would really miss is Apex invoke of your function. So you can get quite far without having access to a functions trial org. So step 2 would be where you get your standalone functions trial org, and then you can start playing with invocations and see how it works from your org. And clearly what would be missing in this scenario is really testing functions in your own org. But by that time, you would have exercised functions from start to finish, and you'd be able to make the decision on whether functions are right for you and whether you want to get that enabled in your org. So with that, I'm going to go to some demos here. And before I play the demos, I do want to encourage people to ask questions and chat. So while the demo is playing, we'd be happy to answer questions.
To develop and run Salesforce functions, you need to set up your development environment. There are a few prerequisites. You need Node.js if you're developing functions that use JavaScript or TypeScript, or OpenJDK for Java. You also need Docker Desktop to build and run functions locally, and Git to deploy your functions code. The next thing you're going to need is Salesforce CLI. You either need to install Salesforce CLI or update your current one. Salesforce CLI comes with two executables, SF and SFTX. SFTX executable is focused on Salesforce platform, and the SF executable is designed to eventually work across all Salesforce clouds. And it supports a functions plugin. So once you update your Salesforce CLI, you would confirm you have the SF executable as well, and you have the functions plugin. The next thing you're going to need is either the Salesforce SDK for Node.js. These provide constructs for you to interface with the platform from functions. And the last thing you're going to need is Salesforce extensions for Visual Studio Code so you can develop from that environment. With all of this in place, we are ready to develop in functions.
All right, so that's setting up the development environment. So the next video I'm going to play is how you can create a Salesforce project and functions. And this is a video that shows how functions development is a simple add to Salesforce development, and how we make it easy for you to just quickly adopt functions as an add-on to what you already do.
With our development environment in place, we are now ready to start our functions project. As step number one, I'm going to use the SFTX command to create a Salesforce project. I'm going to call it My Function Project. It provides me the scaffolding needed for a Salesforce project. I'm going to switch to the folder. And what I'm going to do now is to create a function within the project. So for that, I'm going to use the SF generate function command, specify the name for my function, and also the language as JavaScript. So I have generated a function. I can also generate a second function called, let's say, my function 2. And I now have two functions in my project. To see how this looks in Visual Studio Code, I'm going to switch to VS Code here. Click on the project, and there is a folder here called Functions. And it has both the functions that I generated. I'm going to click on my function here and look at index.js. I already have the scaffolding needed for a function here. With our development environment in place, we are now ready to start our functions project.
All right, I apologize. I'm not sure if that video really went through all the way. Farad, did you notice that?
Yeah, it looks like it suddenly skipped a few, few minutes.
Okay, got it. Yeah, I'm going to go to the next video, but hopefully, the audience would have gotten a feel for how easy it is to create functions within the current VS Code environment.
With our development environment in place, we are now ready to start.
All right. So the next video is going to show how you don't really need a functions-enabled org to start development of functions locally. So you can actually deploy it locally and even have your functions access data from your org, both read and write.
All right, in this demo, what we're going to do is to develop and deploy functions locally and have it read and write into a Scratch org. So this will give you a feel for how you can pretty much get started with functions right away. So to start with, what I did was to sign up for a dev edition. Anyone can do that. And once I did that, I made sure that Dev Hub is enabled on the dev edition. And what I'm going to do now is to show how you can start developing functions. So first, I'm going to check my environment. And the developer edition that I signed up to is the one that's here. And I already created a Scratch org for me to work with functions. So what I'm going to do next is to switch to VS Code and show the couple of functions that I've developed. They are simple functions. The first one is called functions read from org. And if you look at the index.js, it's going to show that it's going to connect to the org that it gets the context from, and it's going to select ID and name from the standard accounts object. So essentially, it's going to list all the accounts from the org. So let's do the next step, which is I'm going to go into functions folder, first function there, and I'm going to deploy this function. So when I deploy this function, it's going to get deployed in Docker desktop. Fast forward a little bit, the function read from org is deployed. Now I'm going to invoke it with the connected org. So what I'm doing here is running the function locally, but connected to the DevHub org with the payload from the VS Code project. And as you can see, for this function, the payload is empty. So I get my list of accounts back. So quickly, looking at the second function as well, I'm going to switch to this function, which is an example of how we can write to the org, and I'm going to run that. This function is now deployed. And I'm going to run this function with the payload, which has a single account, new account in it. And there you go. It added a new account to the org as specified in the payload. So pretty much with Docker desktop and a Scratch org, you're able to start developing in functions in your local dev environment.
So the last video that I have,
right, in this demo, what we're going to do.
So the last video that I have here is really, an example of how we can invoke functions from Apex from within your org. And I think the Q&A is been going pretty well. We can do it via the chat and Q&A. So I'm going to just play this video as well, and it shouldn't take too long, and maybe we might even have 5 minutes to take any live Q&A.
In the previous demo, you saw how you could develop functions locally and deploy them and even invoke them from CLI. What you couldn't do is
invoke the same functions from Apex code within the org. For that, you need an org that has functions enabled. Here, I have an org that has functions enabled, as you can see here. And I'm going to use this org to show how you can invoke functions from Apex. So let's get started. I'm going to show you my connected orgs. This is the one that has functions enabled. And I've gone ahead and created a scratch org from the functions enabled org as well. The one thing to keep in mind is when you create a scratch org, you need to make sure that you have functions added to the list of features in your scratch org definition JSON. So now what we're going to do is to authenticate against the functions account. You would do that with the same username and password that you use for the org that has functions enabled. All right, so now we are logged on to the functions account as well. So the next thing we're going to do is to create compute environment. All right, let me go ahead and do that. So it's creating compute environment for my scratch org, and looking at my environment list, I should see a new compute environment. All right. So the next step is we're going to deploy the functions we already developed. So there are two functions. Function one is function read from org. The other one is function write to org. All right. So the way you deploy functions, all right, so it's pushing changes to functions. So while we are doing that, what we can do is to review how we are going to create the Apex invoke. So I'm going to switch the terminal here real quick and then create a class for invoke. And I'll switch to the VS Code window. And what I'm going to do is to replace the function here with a call to function read from org. And the payload is an empty object. I'm going to save this. And one thing I need to make sure is that the API version is 53, which supports functions. So going back to my deployment, it's still deploying to my compute and it's done just in time. All right, so now we are ready to push our Apex class to this org. All right, so the class with the function invoke is now deployed. So what we're going to do is open up the developer console before we actually execute the invoke. Going back here, I'm going to finally execute the class that we just pushed to the org and invoke the function. All right, so now we have the log here, and you can see that there is a response from the function with the list of account records. Switching to the developer console, you can look at the execution details here as well. So what we did in this demo is invoke functions in its compute environment from within Apex. All right, so I'm going to move back to this slide here and leave it on the screen. Again, you can get started with functions without need for a standalone functions trial org. You can do pretty much anything except for Apex Invoke. And then once we release a trial org, functions trial org, you'll be able to do Apex Invoke as well. So that's how you can get started. We have about 4 minutes or so for any live questions that Varad and I would be happy to take.
Thanks, Shyam.
Right.
So I have a question in the Q&A time. So Chandan is asking, is there any concurrency limit? Like, how many concurrent functions can run at one particular time?
Yeah. So Varad, would you be able to take the question or the
Yeah.
limits?
So yes, so the standard limits that we have currently will still apply. So if you are talking of uh, making API requests from a function into core, you have this limit of 25 calls which last 20 the limit is 25 calls which can last up to 20 seconds or longer. So if you have more than 25 calls, which are API requests, the current Salesforce limit will not, will stop you there. So you cannot go past that limit, and that applies to functions as well. But if you're talking of functions executing asynchronously outside of the core, I mean, there you have a whole range of limits that, I mean, a whole range of capabilities. For example, you can execute for 15 minutes and go up to 3 gigabytes. So I hope that answered the question.
So let's say a function is running for 15 minutes. How many such functions can run at a time?
So there is no limit on the number of functions that you can
Okay.
run at a time. The only limit is when you make those API requests back, which is the 25 uh, calls which are running 20 seconds or longer.
All right. So Chandan, hope that answered your question. Everyone else, we still have some time. If you want to ask more questions, I put it in the Q&A tab and I can ask them for you. So Joey asks, where do we do error handling?
Yes. So you can do the error handling either on the function side or on the Apex side. But if you are doing it on the function side, for example, in Java, you can use your traditional try catch. Or the same thing in JavaScript. You can wait for your execution, catch the error, and appropriately return a response back to core. So that's one way of handling the errors. You can also handle errors on the Apex side as well. And I think we have a best practices doc, right, Shyam, where we discuss a lot of these. Yeah. So you can take a
Right.
look at that as well. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
There is also on developer.salesforce.com, there is a whole section dedicated to functions development, and we discuss best practices there as well when it comes to logging and error handling.
I see
So
a
Jack
question. Yeah.
asked, what is the best use case to use functions? Is it for processing large data set only? So maybe you want to show that slide again.
Yep, I can do that. Let me find the slide here real quick. All right. So what we would say is that it's not just for processing large data sets. Sometimes you want uh, for a function to do something really specific, real quickly, but then you need the scale to invoke that thousands of times. Especially when it's a user-driven interaction. So you can use functions for those cases as well.
So also in that, let me add, you have 15 minutes and 3 GB. So traditional Apex, you do not have that much time as well as heap size. So any use case that fits that kind of a requirement would be perfect for functions.
Yeah, the keyword here is the elasticity. So which is what functions provides.
Yep.
So we have another question from Chandan where he asks, where can we find the configuration setting related to functions that can be changed based on the use case?
I don't think I quite understand that question. Bharat, do you have thoughts on that?
Configuration setting for what? For the functions, or can you expand on that question?
Yeah, Chandan, please add in a little bit more context. But I'm assuming maybe, I mean, until he gives more explanation, could it be related to, like, let's say in Heroku, you get to add more dyno power whenever you want and remove it after it's done? So is there something like that for functions, or is it all automatically managed by Salesforce depending on the load that is put on the server?
Right. So it's currently as of now everything is automatically managed. We do have plans for providing some configuration settings in future, but for now we do not have those settings.
Okay.
I think one of the design goals we have is that we essentially want to be able to handle a lot of things without the user having to configure it. But based on how customers use it over the next few quarters, we want to understand and provide the fine-grained control that they are looking for. So that's definitely, as Varad mentioned, we want to be able to get there. But at this point, we try to automatically manage all the settings.
All right. So, people, any more questions for the wonderful product managers we have here?
If there are any questions, I did add my Twitter and LinkedIn to my profile. Please do reach out to me. I'd be happy to answer questions, get feedback. This session is just about an hour, but my ears are always open for feedback and how we can make this product better. So, and shout out to Jody here who asked the tough question. When are we going to show some real world examples? We are working on that, and we'd be happy to share it in future sessions with with the audience.
All right. So, one final question, I guess. So, Jason asks, is there a Trailhead module or project for functions?
There is a Trailhead module for sure, but I don't believe there is a project. Bharat, correct me if I'm wrong.
Yeah, it's not, I think, out yet, but I think the functions recipes is one place where they can look for examples and, if they want to get started. But I don't think Trailhead is out there yet.
Oh, thanks, Jerry. Appreciate it. All right.
Cool. So I don't think there are more questions. So thank you, Varad and Shyam, for your time and for explaining what is happening around the functions, which is the most awaited feature for quite some time. And audience, I hope you found this session helpful. And as Shyam and Varad mentioned, you can get in touch with them offline in case you have further questions. And we are almost done with this session. I mean, if you still want to stay on and ask a few questions, you can, but we already have another session that has started, which is around Experience Cloud. So you might want to click Sessions tab on the left and navigate to that session, or click on the link that Jerry pasted in the chat. So it's up to you. Ask more questions or join our next session.
All right. Thanks, Aditya. Thanks for having us. I will, we'll hang around for a little longer to answer any questions. But as I mentioned, please feel free to reach out to me via Twitter or LinkedIn or even plain email. So everything works.